To this week's lecture in Spirituality in the Brain. Tonight the theme is applying neuroscience to the spiritual process. Over the last few weeks, a lot of information been given. And this week we're going to talk about how to actually use it in practice. So, to begin, we're back as we were with the temporal lobes. And the temporal lobes of the brain are the source for most spiritual experiences. There have been several papers published, a couple of books that deal in this. The case for the temporal lobes being more or less the center or the seat for spiritual experiences is quite strong. But where I'm going to start tonight is with the fact that there's actually a kind of epilepsy that stays in the temporal lobes. And not surprisingly, it's called temporal lobe epilepsy. It's also called complex partial epilepsy. Complex because it can have a wide range of phenomena that goes along with its seizures, as well as involving a number of different brain parts. And it's called partial because it doesn't spread to the whole brain. The temporal lobes have lower firing thresholds than other areas of the brain. So it's possible for activity to start there and then stay there without actually reaching a threshold to spread into other areas of the brain. So of course temporal lobe epileptic seizures are not convulsive. The person doesn't shake, they don't foam at the mouth. In fact, from the outside you might not even know they were having a seizure. Now, because spiritual processes and experiences seem to be sort of based in the temporal lobes, and temporal lobe epilepsy is confined to the temporal lobes, it's not too surprising that some temporal lobe epileptic seizures, some complex partial seizures, actually involve dramatic spiritual experiences. They're not common, and one of the things I should emphasize is that temporal lobe seizures can often have very, very mundane phenomena that goes along with them. In fact, the single most common phenomena that comes up in temporal lobe seizures is lip smacking. The person smacking their lips or making automatic movements with their mouths over and over again. From the outside it doesn't look like much, and from the inside there's nothing really phenomenal going on. Spiritual seizures are only a small part of the total range of experiences that temporal lobe epilepsy can create. There's a EEG pattern showing the spiking that's characteristic of epilepsy. And with grand mal seizures, the kind where a person can actually fall down and convulse, their body can become rigid, this kind of thing can be found all over the brain. With the temporal lobes, it's only found in the temporal lobes. So in the course of temporal lobe epileptic seizures, and again, these aren't common, but the events have included visions of God, out-of-body experiences, the visual experience of a total, absolute, but clear blackness, intellectual revelations, kind of insights where in the middle of their seizures they feel that they have somehow contacted the information that drives the universe. Sometimes feelings of connectedness where they feel they're one with all things. And of course one of the most common spiritual experiences that comes up with temporal lobe epilepsy is a mind that's absent. Mind that's empty of words, total inner silence, which is a very much sought after state in Buddhism, but when it happens during a seizure, it's actually not too pleasant. In fact, most of the really powerful temporal lobe experiences have been fairly unpleasant. And these have included a feeling of impending doom, a strong sense of unfamiliarity with things to the point where a person can actually feel alienated from their environment. Deja vu. The time has slowed down for a few temporal lobe epileptics during their seizures. There can be feelings of profound loneliness, as though you're the only person alive in the world. One person who had this experience regularly told me that they had the sense that there had been a nuclear holocaust. The world had been destroyed and only their home had been left intact. They were that lonely. Another one that can come up is the feeling that your body has changed, so that the normal shape and size of your body can be disturbed. You can feel you're very much larger or smaller than usual. Or you can feel that one side of your body has gotten too big and the other is too small, something like that. And then depersonalization. And the illustration you'll see on the screen right now actually shows some drawings of a kid who had a type of seizures. They're related to temporal lobe seizures, but they're not quite the same thing. It's impossible to find an illustration for a true temporal lobe epileptic seizure. But the feeling is of depersonalization. One moment the person is there, then they're gone, and then they return. And in the meantime, they can't really account for what happens from the outside. Their eyes will stop being quite so open. They'll lose a lot of their body tone. Sometimes it's enough that they can actually fall over, which is why the kid in the illustration is wearing a head harness. Anytime this child sat on a chair, there was a danger that they would have a seizure and fall over and hit their head. From the outside, this just looks like a sort of daydreaming version of sleepwalking. The person can be going through the motions over and over again, whatever it is. I remember being told of a case where a person found themselves wiping a dish over and over again for a good solid 5 minutes, drying the same dish, until someone came and said, "Hey, you've been drying the dish for too long," and kind of nudged them on the arm, and that pulled them back, and they were able to continue doing the dishes. I do want to emphasize, and this is for primarily professionals who are really interested in this sort of thing, as well as those among you who take a lot of notes. Spiritual experiences may be born of the temporal lobes, and temporal lobe epilepsy may be confined to the temporal lobes. But the next conclusion that many researchers have drawn won't hold up, and that is that spiritual experiences are epileptic events. Spiritual experiences are not epileptic events. Rather, the pathology of epilepsy can leave a seizure involving or recruiting any part of the brain you care to name. There are a few very deep structures that don't become involved very often, but nearly anything between your ears can be accessed by an epileptic seizure. So it is my contention that spiritual experiences happen when areas of the brain that are wired for these experiences and that are ordinarily and organically initiated during the death process get involved in an epileptic seizure. The areas of the brain that normally function at the time of death and are normally sort of hidden away until that moment comes can still be accessed pathologically by an epileptic seizure. So an epileptic seizure can involve an out-of-body experience, but that doesn't mean that the brain produces out-of-body experiences only in response to seizural events. There's an organic, natural circumstance under which we might see God, an organic, natural circumstance under which we might find ourselves feeling incredible bliss. But just because those same experiences come up during an epileptic seizure doesn't mean that they're seizure-related. They're related to an organic function that is pathologically initiated during a seizure. So one of the things that people with temporal lobe epilepsy experience often is a class of experiences called temporal lobe signs. And they also have the name of CPES, complex partial epileptic signs, are déjà vu, jamais vu, which is kind of an opposite to déjà vu. In déjà vu, you feel that the present moment is more familiar than it has any right being. And in jamais vu, you can find yourself looking at something completely familiar or in a very familiar circumstance, and yet feel that it's completely new or alien or strange. Another one is the sensed presence, where you feel that there's someone watching you, but when you turn to look, there's no one there. Another one is paresthesias, pins and needles, tingly, electrical, buzzy sensations that run through the body. And the other one is vestibular sensations. And vestibular sensations are what you get if your body's balancing system goes out of whack, so that you can feel that your body is moving when it's actually still. It's most common when people are falling asleep, but I've also experienced it myself in the course of certain meditation practices. So one of the questions that comes up most often when I mention déjà vu is people raise their hands and they say, well, what is déjà vu anyway? And first I'll say there are several theories, and I adhere to one, but not all of them. So I only represent my own paradigm in talking about déjà vu, and there are other paradigms available that you can look into. First of all, I need to be clear on what déjà vu is. Déjà vu is the sensation that the present moment has happened before. And that's different from spontaneously remembering a vivid dream. That's different from simply a familiar feeling, where a place may actually resemble a place you've been before. But I'm rather talking about the sensation that the present moment, with everything in it exactly as it's happening now, has happened in the past. Now, the normal way that we access the past, the mind's normal sense of the past, comes through a brain part called the hippocampus. And you'll see it illustrated in the current slide. And the hippocampus consolidates and retrieves memories. It takes present moment experience and turns it into memories that we can then retrieve. And because memory is the way we usually access the past, it becomes a pretty simple explanation to say that déjà vu involves a kind of misfiring or an unusual activation of memory mechanisms, because that's where our sense of the past is to be found. Now, I enjoy history. I'll watch samurai movies that are set in the 15th century. I'll watch PBS documentaries about the Byzantine Empire and so forth. And that is a different sense of time. That's a sense of the past that I've actually artificially, through a certain amount of intellectual effort, created for myself. It was work to know that things of the 15th century happened after things of the 12th century, and I had to assemble a sense of history together in order to be able to gain that sense of the past. But when I think of my own past, when I was 20, when I was 10, when I was 5, that's a very personal sense of time, a sense of the past. And that is very much involved in normal functioning of the brain part called the hippocampus, which word, by the way, just means seahorse, because early anatomists, when they cut into the brain, found it and they said, oh, that's shaped like a seahorse, so let's call it the seahorse. People who repair cars don't have that problem with their nomenclature, their names for things. Memories are created, consolidated in the hippocampus, and they're retrieved from hippocampal processes. The hippocampus is very deeply involved in working with memories. And so, what's déjà vu? Déjà vu is the experience of overconnectedness in the hippocampus and the area around it. There's an area of the cortex of the brain, the surface of the brain, which is kind of tucked up underneath, and it's called the parahippocampal region. And that simply means the area around the area around the hippocampus. And there are some very technical sounding names for the parts of this area. The pararhinal cortex just means it's near the nose. The entorhinal cortex, the parahippocampal cortex, and the dentate gyrus, for those of you who want to look up these parts and get a better sense of what they do. And these are cortical areas on the surface of the brain, which seem to have to do with the actual storage of memory. So there's one brain part that turns our present experience into something we can remember, and that same brain part is involved in reaching from the present moment to moments in the past so that we can remember them. When they lose the ability to inhibit one another, when these two areas of the brain are actually connected more intensely than they ordinarily would, then you have the experience of the present moment happening at the same time as your sense of the past. So the present moment feels like it's happened before. Now, so I like to think of déjà vu as a moment when we're actually remembering the present instead of remembering the past. Deja vu is the feeling that the present moment has happened before, but it could also be a memory of the present, which is an odd way of putting it. We think of ourselves as perceiving the present and remembering the past. Deja vu is a moment when both of them can happen at the same time. So, in deja vu, we find ourselves, and I'm giving this spiel a bit so that you can actually look at the illustration, which I think illustrates deja vu very well. The moment that's happening now, with the birds and the horse running by past the house, is at the same time being remembered as though it were coming from the past. The hippocampus, the source for deja vu, has been called the brain's contextualization engine. It puts things into context. It finds context for things, and when we have a perception from outside ourselves or from within, it will actually create a context for it. It will artificially create a setting that the perception can go into so that it can be put into context, because without some kind of context or association, it's very hard to pull up memories at all. So what kind of context could the brain create for a perception that has caught my attention in this moment? And that is, it would create a situation the way it's accustomed to creating situations that don't exist. And where it's accustomed to doing that most commonly is in our dreams. So people who have deja vu often feel that they, or often suddenly remember a dream in which they dreamed the present moment and say to themselves, well, that was a precognitive dream that I forgot until this moment. Well, I wonder what the use for precognition is if you can't access the precognition until the moment when its precognitive prediction comes to pass. Not very useful. So, now there may be such a thing as deja vu that reflects a kind of precognitive perception. But that is a little bit outside the range of normal consensual science, mainstream science. And as much as possible, I like to keep these lectures and these ideas within the framework of science that most scientists will consider, even if they won't accept it. And precognition crosses that line just a little bit. But I will say that there's a book been written on the subject, and it's titled Future Memory, and it's by P.M.H. Atwater, who is a noted researcher in the field of near-death experiences. And she's published half a dozen books. Future Memory is a very interesting one and has an awful lot of case histories from people who've experienced precognitive events. The next of the important temporal lobe signs is jamais vu. Now, déjà vu means, is French, and it means something like ever seen, meaning seen before. Have you ever seen this before? Jamais vu is never seen. Jamais means never in French, and vu means to see in this context. So déjà vu, jamais vu is the experience that everything is strange, dreamlike, surreal, or alien. And in a moment of jamais vu, you can actually look at something as ordinary and familiar as your own hand and find yourself confronted with a vexing sense that this isn't my hand, or I've never seen my hand before. And this can leave you feeling quite disoriented and alienated. So just as déjà vu is too much connection between the deep limbic structure, the hippocampus, and its nearby area on the surface of the brain, jamais vu is what you get when those two normally well-connected areas are completely separated from one another in their function. And if you look on the screen, you will see the hippocampus sort of flashing on and off rather crudely, and other areas on the surface of the brain, part of that parahippocampal region, staying nice and still for you. The next temporal lobe sign is called the sensed presence. And the sense presence happens when you have the feeling that someone is standing behind you or someone is watching you, but when you turn to look, there's no one there. Now, this is an illusion based on a very social brain part, the amygdala, and it happens when communication between the left and right amygdala breaks down. So there isn't quite enough communication between your sense of self on the left side of the brain and your sense of self on the right side of the brain. When this happens, the sense of self that you're not identified with, usually the one that's housed on the right, is projected outside of you, where you experience it as an outside entity or a being of some kind. The next one is paresthesias, tingly sensations, electrical sensations, buzzy feelings in the body. And the brain parts that are involved with that are the parietal lobes, very often on the left side more than the right, although I'm not entirely sure why that is, and a structure deep in the brain called the caudate nucleus, which has been called the brain's emotive visceral integrator. It integrates our emotional state with our body's state of tension or relaxation. So when you have this happening, your body's normal response to your emotions can go a bit overboard, and you can find that more than just having your body be excited by something or your body pleased by something, it can actually give you so much input in the form of tingles and chills that run up your spine and so forth, that it can actually compete with whatever it is has given you that pleasure. So people have tingly sensations during sex. It's very common while listening to music. The operatic soprano reaches her crescendo, the orchestra wells up, you're overwhelmed with a barrage of exquisite music, and you just go, ah, and the chills run up your spine. If they get too intense, they can actually take some of your attention away from the music. So this seems again to be another case of activity sort of overflowing or spilling out from one structure to another. The next one is called vestibular sensations, and I hope the camera stays on this one long enough to let the viewers interpret it well. But that's the sensation you get when your body's orientation system gives you misleading information. So that, for example, with vertigo, you come to the edge of a very high cliff and you look down. There's no one pressing you to fall over. Nothing's happening except looking down. Your sense of space, which ends at your feet on a normal floor, can suddenly, at the edge of the cliff, be extended out to an enormous space. And the result is your brain can't quite orient itself in space between the nearby space you're standing on and the very, very far away one at the bottom of the cliff. And it's just too much orientation information coming at once. You get a bit dizzy from this and you say, whoa, I think I need to take a step back. The most common time for vestibular sensations to appear in the course of temporal lobe activity is when you're falling asleep, the so-called hypnagogic phase or the twilight phase of sleep. And then people can find that their bodies are moving when they're falling asleep, rising. The bed can seem to rise, fall, rock, even spin. And the other place it comes up for a lot of people, and I actually found this one a bit frightening when I was a child, was if someone mounted a camera on the front of a roller coaster, let the camera run while it was recording the roller coaster's motion as an ad for an amusement park or something. I would actually find myself getting disoriented by that and have to look away from the TV, as if somehow watching television was going to throw me over a cliff. Of course it wasn't going to be able to do that, and I wasn't young enough to actually think that such a thing was possible. But my body's sense of its location, orientation in space, and movement was such that it felt like a real danger. And of course the easy way to eliminate any danger coming from the television is to look away from it. A thing I like to point out to people when they're getting scared during a scary scene in a movie. You want that to stop? Turn off the TV. And this one has its origins in two different areas of the brain. Here we have the hippocampus, the upper left panel, as you can see. And we have an area on the right side of the brain, on the surface of the brain, which carries the cumbersome name of occipitotemporoparietal region. And it's just the area where the occipital lobe, the temporal lobe, and the parietal lobe all seem to come together. And this area is also very important in maintaining our spatial perception. So these are some of the very common signs of temporal lobe epilepsy. So a good epileptologist confronted with a new patient and he's wondering about whether or not this person has temporal lobe epilepsy, should they go on and do more intensive screenings, is they'll ask them these questions. How often do you experience deja vu? How often do you have the feeling that someone's standing behind you? How often does everything turn alien, dreamlike, or strange? Does your body tingle? Does it move when it's at rest? And if the answers to these are yes, enough, then they will be given a clue that this may be temporal lobe epilepsy and not something else like psychiatric disorders. One of the things that I learned in the course of doing my basic studies to empower myself to give these talks and understand these ideas was the claim that 60% of all temporal lobe epilepsy was misdiagnosed as some kind of psychiatric disorder. And I've even caught a few cases of temporal lobe epilepsy, and I'm not a doctor, but I would ask people about these experiences and they'd be yes, yes, yes in their endorsing of these items. And then I say, well, go get yourself to an epileptologist, get a referral, and have them do a screening for that. It couldn't hurt. And in a couple of cases, the word came back to me, once from the person and once from someone I never met, but it came by email, that they in fact had been diagnosed with complex partial epilepsy, and now they didn't have to take the medicine for schizophrenia anymore. And although they were not well, because there is no cure for epilepsy per se, they were actually doing much better. And of course, I feel very good when I think about that. But those are signs of epilepsy. Discrete experiences that are signs of epilepsy, not firm diagnostic markers, but simply signs that epilepsy may be probable with this person or that. The other point is the temporal lobe personality. And I'm not sure how many people use this exact phrase. I may be the only one. But there is a personality that comes up for people with very active temporal lobes. Whether the activity in the temporal lobes has to do with a strong predisposition to spirituality, whether they're very spiritual people, or whether it comes up in association with temporal lobe epilepsy. Both groups have enough in common that to me it looks like there is such a thing as a temporal lobe personality. The personality that you get when a person's frontal lobes aren't really working hard enough, aren't contributing as much to their consciousness as the temporal lobes are more active than they ordinarily would, contributing too much to the person's ongoing states of consciousness. And there are 5 traits that I've noticed with the temporal lobe personality. And 4 of these were first discovered by the great epileptologist Norman Geschwind, and it's called Geschwind syndrome. And it has 4 traits. Hyperreligiosity. Now the paper was published in the early 70s when the mainstream medical community was a bit less friendly towards spirituality than it is today. And you couldn't say a spiritual person, you would say a hyper-religious person. The next trait is hypergraphia, which relates to another trait called viscosity. Hypergraphia means the tendency to write at length. And viscosity is a word that anyone who works with people and is interested in psychology ought to have in their vocabulary. It actually comes from physics, where it's used to describe fluid dynamics. Honey is very viscous. Water is not. Viscosity is defined as resistance to change in flow. And if that doesn't describe some people's personalities, I don't know what does. So a hypergraphic person gets writing about something and they cannot stop. And this is a little bit different from people who simply keep restating their phrases. I do that myself, but it's not because I'm viscous. It's because in the course of doing these lectures, I'm often phrasing things for the first time while I'm talking. And if another way to phrase it comes to mind, I'll throw it out as well. That's a different trait from simply being unable to shut up. And I am compelled to speak here not by neurosis, but rather by the clock. So the next trait is irritability, which refers to a specific pattern in anger. It doesn't mean that the person is easily angered, although it can mean it in some cases. If we are talking about a temporal lobe epileptic and the locus, the origin point, the beginning point of their seizures is on the left side of their brain, then they may well be very easily angered. But the characteristic feature of temporal lobe epileptic anger, or the anger pattern of the temporal lobe personality, is that the anger comes quickly, is very intense, it's gone, and then very frequently afterwards they feel just awful about it. And that's because the anger itself represents a burst of activity on the left side of the brain. When that burst fades out, the same areas on the right side of the brain will become active, sort of draining off that electrical activity, giving it an outlet. And the right side of the brain tends to right hemisphericity and right hemispheric activation tends to correlate with things like depression and low self-esteem. So one minute they're so important that it's, how dare you take a sip from my can of Coke? And then when that instant of rage is gone, they realize how self-important they've been. The activity drains off into the right side of the brain, so to speak, and then they think, oh my God, how could I respond that way to a simple can of Coke? How could I be that tied up with my 5-cent aluminum can deposit? And they feel awful. The next one is called altered sexuality. And altered sexuality can be of two types. One type is hyposexual, very low interest in sex. And these hyper and hyposexuality refer not to the amount of hormones the person's body is secreting, not to their capacity for the act of sex itself, but rather their overall level of interest. Some people are very interested in sex and they can't seem to think about anything else sometimes. Other people almost never think of it at all unless something happens to make them think about it. The first would be hypersexual, the second would be hyposexual. At one time, hypersexuality in women was known as nymphomania and in men was known as satyriasis. And hyposexuality was once known as frigidity, and in a testament to the incredibly sexist character of the traditional academic world, as far as I know, there was no name for male hyposexuality. Perhaps there were priests or teachers somewhere who decided that a lack of interest in sex in men was actually a healthy thing, and didn't give it a name. The fifth trait, which was not one of the 4 traits given by Norman Geschwin in his paper, the interictal behavioral syndrome of temporal lobe epilepsy, is hyperemotionality. Many of the structures that are at work in the temporal lobes, the emotional structures, get included in temporal lobe seizures, get included in whatever temporal lobe processes drives a spiritual person. So they can find that their emotions become enormously intense. I know a woman who, if you give her something delicious to eat, will literally explode her appreciation for it. And for a couple of moments actually can't eat because the first bite was so delicious, her emotional response is so strong that if she eats in that moment, her own emotions will be the object of her attention and not the food that she's appreciating. And I can't tell you the author's name, but there is a paper in publication called The Schizophrenia-like Psychosis of Temporal Lobe Epilepsy. And this is one of those papers where the researcher realized how intensely emotional the temporal lobe epileptics were and went in to look at their emotions. It's actually strong enough that it could give you a schizophrenia-like profile for some temporal lobe epileptics. As it turns out, I don't think it's actually a good way of looking at it. The pathology of temporal lobe epilepsy can include any emotions, not just those that denote schizophrenia or depression or anxiety. All of them can come up for temporal lobe epileptics when they're not having seizures. So let's look at these traits one by one. Hyperreligiosity. Now, you could be dealing with monks, nuns, or spiritual people, or you can be dealing with real live religious nuts. The end of the world is coming tomorrow. Repent, give your life to Jesus, begin meditation now. But their spirituality is always presented. First of all, it's usually bound up with a set of concrete religious beliefs, which they often can and will rattle off for you. At the same time, they can weave everything into a fabric of religious belief. Excuse me, you dropped a quarter. And the man leans down, he picks it up, and he says, thank God you were here. Without you, I wouldn't have this quarter. God wants me. God, in his heaven, Lord and Master and Creator of the universe, wanted me to have this quarter. And that's why he put me here to guide this moment. Praise be. Everything gets woven into spirituality or religion, one way or another. And of course, such people can be extremely tedious. There's actually a case on record of a temporal lobe epileptic who was, in fact, hyper-religious, but the religion that his pathology was woven up with was atheism. So once his therapist asked him, do you ever even go inside of a church? And he said, no, God would strike me dead if I went into a church. There are a couple of other quotes I could weave into it, but I think you get the point. When a person becomes so very involved in atheism, as can happen with the driving force of temporal lobe epilepsy behind it, even atheism can become an all-pervading religion that encompasses everything and that has something to offer each and every moment. Another point that relates to hyper-religiosity in temporal lobe epilepsy is a phenomenon called frequent or multiple religious conversions. And there was a paper called Multiple Religious Conversions in Temporal Lobe Epilepsy published by Dewhurst and Beard, another pair of well-known epileptologists, probably published 30 or 40 years ago. And they documented a number of cases where people having multiple temporal lobe epileptic seizures would find themselves switching religions very often. The next trait we should look at is hypergraphia, moving on from hyperreligiosity, that trait of compulsive writing. And what they will do is, hypergraphic people will often fill volume after volume after volume with their writings, usually on spiritual themes, very often on metaphysical themes. I wish I could have found it to illustrate this trait, but I once found someone's notebook on the street that was filled with comments of all sorts. Names of gods appeared prominently in it. Alchemical phrases appeared, and there were lots of illustrations from the Kabbalah. And I went through this person's notebook and said, wow, I've got to keep this so I can scan it, so I can use it in a presentation, but alas, I seem to have been unable to find it. But this kind of a notebook is the classic example of hypergraphia. It's not just that they write continually. What they're writing about has a tremendous importance to them. And it's very, very personal in its meaning. These things mean something to the person who's writing them. You can read it and find absolutely nothing of consequence. And yet in the moment when they wrote it, you can be sure they were often filled with a tremendous excitement and a real sense of the importance of what they were writing about. And they will go on and on. One beautiful thing about the printed page is that they are the uncontested master. No one can interrupt their pen. No one can criticize what they're writing. There can be no breaks for commercial interruptions. No one will review it. They are the uncontested, absolute master of the page. And they can go on and on and on until something forces them to stop writing. Sometimes it's literal physical exhaustion. And this same trait appears in their normal conversation, because when they get started talking about something that they find engaging or intriguing or important, it can be really difficult to get them to change the subject. So that you get them started on the hidden esoteric meaning of the book of Job, and you can find yourself in a socially uncomfortable position or sitting still for several hours of their thoughts on this subject. And the strange thing about it is that they usually don't seem to repeat themselves. They may make their point in more than one way, but the material they come up with on the printed page or in their actual spoken discourses can be really fresh. Sometimes they're regurgitating and restating things they've learned elsewhere, but very often it's actually fresh, original, philosophical thinking. Now, in our normal lives, people who have very active temporal lobes, but aren't all the way to the edge of temporal lobe epilepsy, can find themselves expressing the same trait through simple things like keeping a diary or a journal, a normal sketchbook, something like that, where their thoughts, feelings, and inner images can be put on the printed page. I know someone who has many signs of active temporal lobes, who actually fills notebook after notebook with an absolutely brilliant diary that takes a comic book form, and where everything that they experience gets put into these pages, but it's their commitment is to creativity and an engaging graphic style. And everyone who sees the notebook say, this is publishable stuff, this is brilliant stuff. So the reason I am putting the emphasis on this is because not all temporal lobe epileptic writings reflect a deranged or disordered mind. Sometimes it's actual creative brilliance that's coming through. Dostoevsky is well known now to have had temporal lobe epilepsy. And the sheer size of his books reflects his tendency to hypergraphia. What distinguishes Dostoevsky from the religious nut who fills notebooks is that Dostoevsky knew how to let a plot unfold. And his books, however much they express temporal lobe epileptic pathology, remain absolutely brilliant stuff. His descriptions of bliss attacks in The Possessed are quoted very, very often in the literature of temporal lobe epilepsy. In fact, because of it, positive temporal lobe seizures have been nicknamed Dostoevskian seizures. So let's move on to the next trait, irritability. There isn't much to say about it, simply because it's such a common experience that I don't need to throw a lot of words on it to get everyone to understand. But anger in short bursts, followed by, oh, I wish I hadn't said that, is a common experience, and nearly everyone has it. Some people have it rarely, some people have it every hour on the hour, but nearly everyone has it. The important thing that I want to say about this trait, besides locking down in your minds that it is one of the temporal lobe epileptic traits, is that it almost never leads to violence. Temporal lobe epileptics, people or people with very active temporal lobes, tend to express themselves with words, not actions. When you find someone with the same pattern of anger, who does act it out and does hurt people, you're more likely to be dealing with someone with mania, proper psychiatric mania, than temporal lobe epilepsy. And of course, a lot of times the diagnoses are missed because one of the great tragedies of temporal lobe epilepsy is that psychiatric disorders are described in the DSM-4, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Psychiatric and Mental Disorders. Whereas temporal lobe epilepsy, being a physical disorder of the brain, is not listed in the psychiatric. Many psychiatrists don't know anything about it. Our next slide won't appear on camera, but it is the slide for altered sexuality. And altered sexuality refers to hypersexuality or hyposexuality. And here are two classic images. One of them shows a satyr or Pan from Greek mythology, a being who is always thinking about sex, and the other shows quite a classical looking nun, the obvious sample of a person who's never thinking about it. And what seems to be going on here is that if temporal lobe epileptics, or people with very sensitive temporal lobes, find that the left side of the brain is more sensitive than the right, then they're likely to be much more interested in sex than most people. And if it's on the right instead of the left, then they are very likely going to be a lot less interested in sexuality than most people. The last trait in our very short list of traits is hyperemotionality. And that refers to emotions that appear suddenly and with less control than normal. And one point about the temporal lobe personality is that the structures in the temporal lobes are more connected than they usually were, so emotions appear more easily. So for example, if you're watching a TV documentary about some point of psychology and somebody mentions a pattern, depression followed by waking up fresh in the morning. I don't know that there is such a pattern, but it'll do for an example. The temporal lobe epileptic, the person with very sensitive temporal lobes, is the one who is most likely to jump up and say, I have that, I have that. And their reaction to it will be so powerful that it will actually overshadow or upstage the TV show that got them excited, whereas most people who get that once in a while, who get that without having very active temporal lobes, will say simply, oh, I get that too. The emotions will override the non-emotional components of the moment. Now, the next point is concerns a thing called the continuum of temporal lobe events. And the research for this was done by Dr. Michael Persinger and one of his colleagues named Catherine Makarek. And at the top of this illustration, you'll see a bell curve. And a bell curve is what you get when most people fall in the middle of a group of people. But temporal lobe events and temporal lobe sensitivity, or they call it temporal lobe lability, isn't a bell curve. It's a continuum, which we see in the bottom of the two illustrations on the screen there. And what you see there is that the spread is kind of spiky, as you would find in any common population that you looked at. But in fact, there are as many people at the high end of the continuum as there are at the low end. About 1/3 of the people have them often, 1/3 of the people have them sometimes, and 1/3 of the people have them never or almost never. And there are as many people in the middle as there are at each end. So we're not talking about a bell curve. There is no single most common profile of temporal lobe sensitivity. We are all over the map as a species. Okay, so matching temporal lobe signs with spiritual practice. And we're going to take a look at the same brain parts we just went over, but from a different perspective. And here is the hippocampus. The hippocampus is most likely to be active in a person who has déjà vu, who experiences vestibular sensations, feelings of their body moving when it's actually at rest. Another experience that tends to implicate the hippocampus is seeing into an infinite void with their eyes closed instead of seeing the usual dull, black, dark surface of their eyelids. They'll actually be seeing into a large, dark space. And inner vision of any kind, like forms or patterns, which is most common when people are falling asleep, so-called twilight sleep. When this comes up, if a person has déjà vu, jamais vu, has an inner void, inner imagery, and they have things happen to them when they're falling asleep, usually images, pictures of faces or landscapes or things, then it's a good bet that the hippocampus is the most active part of their limbic system. And for such people, there are certain spiritual practices that would appear to be most appropriate. That is to say, if they begin with those practices, they're most likely to have success. And the first of these is meditation, especially the kinds of meditation that are done without words, where you're paying attention to your breathing, or visualization practices where you practice seeing the image of a god or a symbol in your mind's eye. And gazing practices, things like scrying, where into the surface of water, usually it has to be done in a bowl or on a plate that's very dark, and images can appear. And then those images will have something to do with whatever's being thought about. So it's commonly used in psychic readings. The other kind of gazing practice comes from India, where it's known as tratak. And tratak simply means gazing. And that is, you take an object and you keep an unwavering gaze on it. And with time, that can actually start changing the look of whatever it is you're staring at. I did this practice for several weeks at one time. And in that practice, I was encouraged to look into a mirror. And I would look into a mirror with an unwavering gaze, and my face would change, sometimes into other people, sometimes into animal faces, old men, young babies. The spectrum was actually pretty broad. But at no time did I lose the basic facial structure of eyes, nose, and mouth. Occasionally it would all wash out into some kind of completely unformed vision. But For the most part, it was face after face after face. And these kinds of meditation practices go with someone who endorses items on a questionnaire, which was part of the handout tonight, that suggest hippocampal activation. The next brain part is the amygdala. And if someone has frequent experiences of the sensed presence, or hears inner voices, or their emotions are incredibly strong, and again come on with that sudden but not very long-lasting intensity, then it's a good bet that the amygdala is very, very active for them. And for such people, prayer can be an extremely successful practice. And these days, prayer is falling out of favor. Simply praying to God isn't as chic in today's New Age spirituality as it once was. These days, people will put prayer on an even level with meditation. But in fact, most brains are predisposed to have success with one or the other. I wish it got a little more attention than it did. Another practice that seems to implicate the amygdala is the practice of channeling, where you feel you're actually acting as a conduit for some other spirit or some other being, perhaps a god, some famous person from the past that you have a sense of their presence, so you can actually connect with them and have a sense that it's this being and not that being. Occasionally people do channeling and the entity they're channeling for will identify themselves. Another is recitations, another spiritual practice that appears to have fallen out of favor in recent decades. Reciting poetry aloud, sort of to amuse yourself, can be very, very powerful for people with extremely active amygdalas. Devotional practices like ritual worship, actually going to an altar and putting flowers, incense, candles, doing little recitations, would seem to recruit the amygdala. So if your amygdala is very active, you may have some success with that. And chanting, repeating the same phrase over and over again while remaining mindful of the meaning of the phrase. If you get lost in the phrase so that it no longer has any meaning, you've short-circuited the language centers. If you remain involved with a prayer so that you're mindful of the meanings of the words, then that's going to keep you connected to the language centers and will tend to activate the amygdala on the left, the one whose activation involves positive feelings, far more than the amygdala on the right. The next one is the caudate nucleus, and that's again that one that integrates our body's state of relaxation or tension with our current emotional state. And some good signs for an active caudate nucleus would be intense body rushes with emotions, or paresthesias, tingly sensations, buzzy sensations that run through the body. And for such people, there are 3 spiritual practices. One of them isn't often recognized as a spiritual practice, but I feel strongly that it is. And that's body work. Doing massage therapy for other people, putting your energy, so to speak, your attention into the other person's body and allowing their state of health or illness to actually have an impact on your own, so that you're absorbing something, so to speak, from another person. But again, it's through the body, from their mind to their body, to your mind. And I know of a case of a woman who had incredible anxiety attacks. She almost certainly was temporal lobe epileptic, but was never diagnosed as such. And I met her when she was studying massage at a massage school. And she was actually so deeply in anxiety that she was in a state of terror at almost all times. And it was so bad that she wanted to commit suicide. But the thought of suicide was so terrifying that she couldn't engage the thought fully enough to do it. And this went on she said it started when she was quite young, and I met her when she was 45. So we're talking about almost a single anxiety attack that lasted nearly 4 decades. And she went on to do body work. And I said, well, do your body work well. Really get into it. And you will find that the experience of moving your energy, because that's the word that's always used, but moving your attention to what you feel sympathetically from other people's bodies is going to activate different brain parts than the ones that support the anxiety. And with time, you may find that it will have an impact on your anxiety levels. And she said, great, that sounds good. I ran into her about a year later, and I found that by practicing massage 4 or 5 hours every day for something like 9 months, that her anxiety actually went away. And doing body work, massaging other people's bodies for their aches and their pains, made her own fear go away. And one of the things that she said that she felt was important in that was that when she did her body work, she approached it from a position of love. She wouldn't put her hands on the body until she had psyched herself up to feel love for the client, and then she would move forward with it. And this is a really good example of what a spiritual practice is supposed to do. The other spiritual practice, one worth mentioning, is trance dancing. And trance dancing is where you actually do go into a trance when you're dancing. But I feel that it is a spiritual practice, and that it's been one for a very long time. I remember a book called The Lost Worlds of the Kalahari, and I forget the author's name, but he was a European of Dutch extraction who was living in Southwest Africa. And when they got natives to work in the mines, which was done by introducing gambling, which introduced debt and then a need for money, so they would then go to work in the mines in order to get the money to pay their debts, they were working incredibly, inhuman hours in the mines, sometimes 10, 12 hours a day below ground, hunched over. And he said that when they came back to their little huts around the mining center, the offices, that they would stay up all night dancing and would sometimes go 4 and 5 days without sleep, because when the day's work was done, they would rather dance than sleep. And to me, this shows the extreme importance of dance. And actually, there have been archaeological digs that found encampments from tens, even hundreds of thousands of years ago, that found a circle pounded into the ground, so that the archaeologists are digging with their toothbrushes and finding that this section is hard packed and the other areas nearby are much softer. And eventually someone realized that what happened was these were the circles where the people were dancing. Why was it that the fireplace, the ashes were always found in the middle of a circle of hard packed earth? Was going back tens, perhaps hundreds of thousands of years ago. People were dancing around the fire enough to pound the earth down to the point where today the archaeologists could find their old dance floors. Probably dance is the single most important and most widespread spiritual practice that has ever been developed, except for prayer itself. And there are many Native American tribes who to this day believe that dance is a form of prayer. That if you dance without a prayerful intention, your dance will have no power. If you dance with a prayerful intention, you will somehow or other, on some esoteric spiritual level, make things happen. Now there's an exception to these rules. If someone has caudate nuclear signs, signs of altered states that involve the body, that implicates the caudate nucleus. If it's cognitive signs, that implicates the hippocampus. If they're very emotional or very social, if they involve others or other beings, that implicates the amygdala. There can be an exception to this rule. And the exception is that lots of signs from one brain part can mean that it's overactive, or that another brain part nearby is underactive. So activity that would normally go into the underactive one is shunted into the overactive one. In that case, if we're talking about, for example, the hippocampus, a complete failure with hippocampal techniques like meditation can still happen with people who have lots and lots of hippocampal signs of the hippocampus being active. So that if that means that the amygdala, for example, is not active enough, then starting up practices that initiate activity in the amygdala can bring the amygdala into activity quite suddenly and quite dramatically. So usually signs of a particular brain part being very active can mean that that's the one you want to hit with spiritual practice for that practice to be a success. But sometimes it means that moving over into another structure or into practices that activate another structure can be the way to make things work. So if you take this kind of information and try to apply it, it's important to be a little versatile in how you do it. And if you're telling people, you have this sign and that sign, so this practice and that practice might work for you, to hedge your bets enough for them to not give up if your immediate advice doesn't work. And this represents an important application of the principles of neurotheology. The brain science of spirituality can be applied in spiritual practice, but there are other ways as well. There is a thing called the Koren helmet, also known as the God helmet, and there have been many approaches to using high-tech methods for enhancing spirituality, but nothing has been more successful than the Koren helmet, which you'll see here. And the Koren helmet, developed by Dr. Michael Persinger and Stan Koren, has been one of the most successful high-tech approaches to spiritual enhancement, to the induction of spiritual experience that anyone has ever developed. In 1% of the cases, the experimental subjects saw God. Others have experienced out-of-body experiences. One guy who was regularly visited by a ghost in his home found that he re-experienced his frightening apparition while he was in the laboratory. And there's been a wide range of other experiences. People have seen magical sort of crystalline cities and so forth. But the technology is best known for its ability to create visions of God. Now, only 1% of the subjects saw God, but it still gives an indication of, one, how powerful this technology is, and two, how small a section of the population is actually predisposed to have a vision of God. Now, with the Koren helmet, a two-phase procedure was used, and this is the first phase. One signal, it's actually a chirp signal, which is a kind of standard signal that's used in signal analysis and in troubleshooting electronic equipments, was used over the right side of the brain only. And what this did was generally activate the whole right hemisphere and shut down the left hemisphere. Now, when phase 2 came along, 30 minutes later, and the subjects were using a signal that was derived from the amygdala, the burst of activity into the amygdala on the left, which previously had been quiet, could be so great that they would find themselves with a strong wave of bliss and a very strong feeling of a sensed presence. And for the most intense manifestations of this combination of bliss and a sensed presence, it would actually culminate in a vision of God. The left, when the signal is changed from one signal over the right to the amygdala signal over both sides, the left amygdala would respond suddenly, initiating this strong wave of bliss, which people would interpret as God, and in some cases, this interpretation would unfold into a real vision of God. Now, there is a popular version of the technology. It's called Shakti, and you'll see it on the screen here. And it has, because it's commercially available, the reports that come from it are not as tightly controlled as the ones from the laboratory, but there's a much greater range of experiences that come up with it. And there are 3 basic types of experiences. The first is meditation enhancement. The second is mood enhancement. And the third is altered states of consciousness. And actually, I'm going to touch on one specific experience with this, and that is lucid dreaming. And for meditation enhancement, the magnetic coils that Shakti uses are placed over the temporal lobes, as you can see here, with one signal running through left and right stereo channels because it's fed by normal audio output from a computer. And the temporal lobes are given 20 minutes of this or 30 minutes of this. And actually, if people try to meditate while this is going on, their meditation doesn't work very well. The input from the magnetic signals can be giving the brain one set of instructions, while the meditation practice itself will give a related set of instructions, but they're not the same. So if you try to meditate while you're getting the stimulation, the meditation doesn't work very well. But if you wait an hour and a half after the end of this kind of stimulation, then the after discharges from the brain's own response to this stimulation, which takes some time to taper off, several days in fact, can be combined and recruited into the tasking, the job that meditation gives the brain to do, so that whatever area of the brain you're working with can actually contribute to the meditation practice afterwards. It's available for being redirected by meditation. And there have been many people who've used this technology and reported that they found that their meditation went much deeper. In fact, I have heard from people who didn't use it for anything else. They didn't care what happened during the session. They were only looking to enhance the meditation afterwards. Another important way of using the technology is in mood enhancement, and the most successful way of doing that is like the God helmet's procedure for giving you a vision of God. It's a two-phase session, and in the first phase, a signal is applied over the temporal lobes, or actually a couple of signals. The temporal lobes become more active. Now, most negativity, what we come to call negativity, fear, anger, sadness, and so forth, is based on temporal lobe functions. The brain parts that drive these emotions are located deep in the temporal lobes. So in this first part of the session for mood enhancement, the temporal lobes become more active. But it's the first phase, so the extra activity in the temporal lobes builds up slowly. And because most people who have an emotional issue that's leaving them wanting some kind of mood enhancement, these areas are already quite busy, and they respond, but not so much. Then comes the second phase in the session. And in the second phase of the session, the signals are now applied to the frontal lobes of the brain. And if your temporal lobes are very active because of that seesaw arrangement that I mentioned earlier, it goes on between the amygdala and the hippocampus deep in the brain, but it also goes on with the temporal lobes and the frontal lobes of the brain. So that if your temporal lobes are very active, your frontal lobes tend to be fairly quiet. So if someone has a great deal of fear, anger, depression, and so forth, I should say sadness, because depression is a clinical term and I am not a clinician. But if their emotional issues are strong, their frontal lobes are usually less active than they would be in most people, so that moving the signals to the frontal lobes can bring the frontal lobes into a sudden and dramatic activation. And suddenly, the tremendous weight and burden of their own emotions can be lifted from them. And suddenly they'll find that they are no longer grappling with fear, anger, or sadness that much. Someone who's been through the procedure actually told me that what would happen for them was that after this kind of procedure, which was repeated 6 times for that person, they found that something would happen that would initiate fear for them. And they had grappled with anxiety. But the fear would appear as it normally would. Only after a couple of seconds, the fear would stop. And instead they would find themselves thinking about what the best way to respond to whatever made them afraid was. And their response would be cognitive. It would be frontal lobe instead of temporal lobe. And of course, the obvious question from anyone is, has this been investigated for psychiatric disorders? And the answer is yes, with some success, actually marked success, but not to the point where I can claim, sitting here in front of a camera, that it constitutes a new treatment for psychiatric disorders. That would require FDA approval, which this technology does not have yet. The other thing, and I'm going to back up my slides here slightly, is that this same configuration has also got a track record for inducing lucid dreaming. Lucid dreaming involves more frontal lobe activation during sleep than ordinary dream sleep. So what happened was that there were several people who did a series of sessions over their temporal lobes. And then after 4 to 6 sessions, they would then switch to the frontal lobes. And in a couple of cases, this resulted in immediate lucid dreaming. Like the day they moved, 5 sessions over the temporal lobes, 1 session a week later over the frontal lobes, and that very night they would have a lucid dream. Wake up in the morning knowing that they had dreamt, remembering having been fully conscious of being in a dreaming state while they were dreaming, and say, wow, that's cool, I just had a lucid dream. So this procedure, several sessions over the temporal lobes, followed by a single session over the frontal lobes, can initiate lucid dreaming and actually bring into existence the pattern of frontal lobe activity that's typical of lucid dreaming and that has been found in laboratory studies of lucid dreamers. So, the next one to look at with this technology is in general altered states. And I'm going to show you not the only session design that's ever been used for this, but one of the most effective. And it's based on Persinger's God helmet or Koren helmet procedure. And in the first phase, a signal is applied over both sides of the head. And here we have the left stereo channel showing the stimulation. And on the other side, there is another set of coils which has signals from both stereo channels. In the first phase, one channel puts the signal through both sides. In the second phase, the other channel puts it only through one side. In this case, it happens to be the right side. So this would be a very good one for working with the hippocampus. And what happens is that activity begins on both sides of the brain and then is suddenly shunted to one side of the brain. So depending on which signal you use and which side of the head you're talking about, this can actually initiate some quite marked spiritual experiences. And this technology, again, called Shakti, has induced visions, out-of-body experiences, blissful states, and states of incredibly deep relaxation using this and actually some other session designs, but there simply isn't time for me to go over all of them. And this brief overview of using complex magnetic signal technology to induce altered states, lucid dreaming, mood enhancement, and so forth, constitutes what I think is the cutting edge of the integration of science and spirituality. It's not enough to have a good theory to explain spiritual experiences. You've got to take that theory and work it into some kind of experiment or some kind of technology that will actually initiate spiritual experiences in order for that theory or hypothesis to be validated. If we know which brain parts are involved in spiritual experiences, and we have a way to activate those brain parts, and doing so fails to initiate some kind of spiritual experiences, then that theory is probably wrong. But fortunately for me and other people in my field, that's not what we're getting. We're getting that the practice, the technology, does validate the theory. And the other point about mood enhancement with this technology that's important is that it seems to do the same thing that meditation does. If you meditate regularly, focusing on your breathing or a visualization or something, your negative emotional responses to things are supposed to be cut down. So that one day someone gives you a string of bad words, you have a terrible response to them. The boss said, I'm fired. My girlfriend says, I want to see other people, or something like that. After a few years in meditation, you're supposed to be able to take these kinds of experiences on board with a certain amount of equanimity. And the lack of that equanimity would be a sign that a person's spiritual practice isn't really working for them very well. So that brings us to the next subject for tonight, and that is the future of spirituality. So I've spent a great deal of time looking at the science of spirituality. I think I haven't done the worst job that's ever been done of integrating science and spirituality. So what about the future of spirituality? If we're moving away from the true believer's adherence to religion, we're moving into a new kind of spirituality that is somehow more suited to the modern age, what are we going to find? Well, one of the things we're going to find is that spirituality will be much more individualized. It will not be our religion. We are Shakers, we are Quakers, we are Presbyterians, we are Buddhists, and this is what we believe. We're going to be leaving a lot of that stuff behind. And it's going to be very much about what beliefs work or feel right for each person. And I believe that this trend will continue because I really do expect that we're going to find that the beliefs that are most attractive and most engaging to each person will also be beliefs whose themes will initiate the brain parts that feel best in their activation to that individual person. So if this new science of spirituality were allowed to run completely amok and take over all of the world's spirituality, we would once again come to our religion, but each person's instance of that religion would be very different. It would be very personal. We are going to find people more and more mixing and matching their own symbols, their own spiritual practices, their own scriptures, and integrating whatever moves them as individuals. I happen to know every word of Hamlet's soliloquy. To be or not to be, that is the question, whether 'tis nobler, and so on and so forth. Because there was a time that those words really moved me. And so for me, that's a bit like a scripture. Dwelling on the words and the profound meaning of them, the life and death meaningfulness of it all, that really brought a spiritual mood to me. And the time will come when people can integrate anything they like that moves them into that, and the people around them will respect that as sacred to that person. Nothing will be sacred inherently, and everything will be sacred according to how it strikes each person. So nothing will ever be profane either. I think that there will be more high-tech aids that will appear and come into usage. And that does not include just the complex magnetic signal technology that I work with. I have an idea for an invention I haven't been able to develop yet, where you'll have a microphone in front of your nose and a pair of headphones, and it will feed back to you in real time the sound of your own breathing. And I've had enough experience with this using what I can make a computer do to know that it really can deepen the mindfulness of breathing, that classical Buddhist meditation. And I think we're going to find more of that. We'll probably find the garden variety flashing lights and rhythmic binaural beats sounds in greater usage, because they do work for some people. And they create moods in which other spiritual practices can be carried out more fruitfully. We're also going to find just plain more science. And it's not just because I'm doing that kind of science that I say that. It's because science has a claim to truth that religion is powerless to challenge. When the scientific community takes a new idea on board and accepts it as valid because there's evidence and sound theories, well-developed hypotheses that stand behind it, and it gets into the scientific journals, and then from there into our classrooms, that's a kind of truth that religion cannot challenge. I have been told by people that there is an existing God outside of us who created this universe and who has nothing to do with our brains. And I say, well, how do you know this? And they say, I know this because I know. Perhaps they've had a personal vision, a revelation of some kind. Perhaps they have simply been given enough insights, so to speak, that can't be interpreted any other way except in terms of a belief in an objective, externally existing God, so that for them it becomes an unquestioned point of faith. But that notion that it is so because I say it is so, and I know, because I have seen God and talked to God, because I am enlightened, because I have died and come back to life, and therefore I know. This kind of claim to religious truth is going to fall away. It's simply not going to sustain ground, because that could be my truth based on my experiences. Someone else's truth based on their experiences could be different, and there's no proving any of it. except for those fragments of spirituality that science can understand, and that it can somehow, and which understanding can somehow be validated. Once a scientific truth gets locked in, it stays locked in. It may be refined or embroidered or improved upon later on, but once it's in place, it's in place, and nothing can ever remove it. You can change the theory that explains the fact, but once the fact is in, it's in. I also believe that we're going to get beyond the idea that there can be a highest spiritual state. There is no palladium, pinnacle, or ultimate spiritual experience. If you are a traditional believer in Judaism, Islam, or Christianity, then union with God is the highest spiritual state. If you are a Hindu or a Buddhist, then enlightenment, whether it's offered as moksha, liberation, or nirvana, the putting out of your illusory sense of self, becomes the highest religious understanding that's possible. And I think we're going to have to abandon that. There are very, very high spiritual states that might be the highest that this or that person has any realistic chance of achieving, and they can be all over the map. For some people, the greatest spiritual pleasure they may ever experience can be bound up with sex or romantic love. For others, it's got to be about deeper states of meditation. For others, it's got to be total release and surrender into prayer. So we're going to, but more and more, I think, at least in my studies, I'm coming to the conclusion that all of these, take all other conditions being equal, assuming everyone is the same, all of these are equally available within the human experience. So the idea that any one of them could be absolute or highest is going to go. And the other thing is that when science has a coherent picture of spirituality, spirituality will become a subject for study in our school's science classes. This may offend some people, but it will also put the basics of spiritual practice back into our schools, where it once was, when all the people in a culture share the same religion, including the school teacher. Then there's nothing wrong with having the school teacher remind the students of their spiritual lives, to begin a class by calling for a moment of prayer or meditation. Nowadays, we live in a very eclectic society, and when you say, let us all have a moment of prayer, you leave out those people for whom meditation is the highest inroad to what they feel is the highest state. There is some advantage in the scientization of spirituality, because we should be able to find that more people will actually take up spiritual practices when science, that monolithic authority with whom it is so very hard to disagree, offers good reasons to pray, to meditate, to do yoga, to dance, to do a little psychic work, to work on other people's bodies to remove their pain. Imagine several generations from now, when the integration of science and spirituality is complete. Children go to school, and every year in the course of their education they have an overview of the brain, and every year they get a little reminder that prayer does something, that meditation does something. That's going to make it a great deal easier for them to make the decision to enter that yoga class, to go to that temple where meditation is taught, to enter that church and pray, without necessarily believing what the people who maintain those centers believe. We should find more and more people doing spiritual practice. And I think that that is a very, very good thing, and I will be tremendously proud of any contribution I can make to that process. It may take years to spread through the world, but spirituality in the classroom will change the way our children think about spirituality. It will also create another context for thinking about the classical virtues of religion. Things like compassion, generosity, avoiding anger, greed, and self-importance, without allegiance to any one religion. It will be possible for a person to take on board the agenda of perfecting themselves as they feel that agenda should be addressed, without necessarily believing that there will be a God who will punish them, or an opportunity for enlightenment that will be irretrievably missed if they don't believe this or believe that. The the Christians are right, I think. There is a decay of our culture's morality appearing as people lose faith in their traditional religions. When it becomes difficult for people to believe that there is a God on a marble throne with Jesus on the right and the Virgin Mary on the left, and they abandon these kinds of evil, ancient beliefs, it does remove some of the momentum that stands behind the cultivation of personal morality. And an integration of science and spirituality will tend to give people new reasons to engage in moral behavior. A couple of lectures ago, I spoke about near-death experiences and the fact that people very often review their lives in the course of their death process. If people come to realize that they're going to be accountable for what they do during their lives, not to an all-seeing, all-powerful God, but to an aspect of themselves, that's going to give them reason to cultivate a kind of personal morality. And to take a brief aside, I think that this may be what Jesus was talking about when he called on people to repent. Today the word means to be sorry for your sins. I think that Jesus may have meant a more active kind of internal inventorying. Look at your own emotional foibles, your own emotional failings, and look at what kinds of behavior you go through when those things become active. And then do what you can to pull them out of your personality. The repentance that Jesus was talking about may have been a more active moment-to-moment inventorying thing. And I actually took this on board as a spiritual practice after I began to learn about near-death experience. I would remember things that I had done in my past, none of which I will talk about in response to questions tonight, but things where I actually felt ashamed, things where I had done something wrong, something that I knew and that I currently feel is wrong, and remember the event and allow this sense of shame as much room as it could possibly want. And what I found was that over time, it became very easy for me to avoid doing similar things, simply because I had taken the time to realize that I had done this thing out of frustration, done that thing out of anger, done this thing because I was depressed. And my depression boiled up to a point where I had to do something, and I did something crazy. In my life, I've done one or two things where if the circumstance had broken down differently, I might have spent time in jail. And I can now say that I actually live a pretty clean life. I don't hurt people if it's not within my power, if it's within my power to avoid it. When I see people who are suffering or in pain, I actually do extend myself, sometimes very little, sometimes quite a lot, to help them out. And I know that if I had not allowed myself to fully engage a sense of shame at things I've done in the past that I would not want to do again, that I would be less responsive to other people's suffering and more likely to run the red light when I didn't see another car, or pick up that thing that was not mine. And these are things that adapt me to live in my culture. Almost all good and bad behavior is good and bad because of how it impacts on other people with whom we live in a cultural setting. And I want to return to a theme that came several lectures ago, that culture is our evolutionary strategy. Relying on our culture is how we survive. And that brings me to the next short theme for tonight, and that is the future of our species. We live in culture. It's the way we survive, by relying on one another. Our old people years ago, many years ago, didn't get eaten by the jaguars because in spite of the fact that they were old, they could still outrun them. They didn't get eaten by jaguars because the young people respected the wisdom that they had. So when a jaguar invaded the tribe's encampment, the young men would step forward to defend everyone, so the old people didn't have to do it for themselves. And as a result, our life expectancy went way up. And the reservoir of relevant knowledge, wisdom that we had was larger, so that there were old people with experience at living who knew what to do, the right thing to do in so many circumstances. And they have the young warriors who defended them to thank for it, and the young hunters who fed them to thank for it. But they also had the fact that they lived in a culture to explain their own survival. So I think the future evolution of mankind is going to come through cultural development. And I think that culture is going to come through an increasing reliance on spirituality, both for our guidance as individuals, which I think is already happening now, and as a group, so that the realities of politics, education, and the way people live as individuals is going to become ever more spiritual and going to have spiritual values injected into it in an open and explicit way. Because there will stop being as much diversity in our spiritual thinking and a great deal more diversity in our individual spiritual lives. And when we recognize that everyone's spirituality is as good as our own, and that everyone's spirituality involves the fundamental virtues of charity towards others, compassion for living things, stewardship of the earth, the avoidance of anger, greed, and self-importance, when these values are held in common by everyone, and yet the individual expression of these values is left to each individual, we're going to agree so much that these values can begin to shape our political, our educational, our cultural forms and, pursuits, as well as the entertainment that we choose for ourselves and for our children. We're going to find enough of a shift in the way we think that we will change the way we live, and with it, the world that we live in. And that's it for tonight.